Okay, hello. I am back and I'm going to read you the last section. There were quite a bit of pages in each chapter. These are big chapters, so I'm breaking them down into 3 parts. So this goes from page 61 to 75, and this discusses their time in India. So I'm going to show you some pictures of them. Queen George and Queen Mary, and they are in India, so you can see that. They really loved India. I mean, he was not much of a traveler, but he really loved India, which was I think it's a very fascinating country, but they really love India. So, but I will not dwell too much further, but it was still under the British Empire, and it was a very important country to them. So, but I will get started on reading. Reluctantly abandoning both children and pheasants, the Prince and Princess of Wales left Sandringham in October 1905 for their first visit to India. They landed at Bombay for the battleship Renown on 9 November and sailed for Europe on 19 March 1906. During those 18 weeks, they covered 9,000 miles by train and several hundred more by carriage and motor car. It was a journey that carried them to Jaipur and Lahore, Delhi and Agra, Gwalior and Lucknow, and so on to Calcutta, Rangoon, and Mandalay. Then the sea across the Bay of Bengals to Madras, on to Mysore, and then north of Hyderabad through the central provinces to the northwest frontier, down to Karachi, and the voyage home. The cold print of that itinerary conceals an exhilarating and at times almost mystical experience which the Prince and Princess of Wales never forgot. More than 70 years later, it was not easy to recapture the near unanimous satisfaction and pride with which Great Britain gazed upon her as an Indian empire, a more sacred trust than an administrative or commercial union, a partnership in which the balance of advantage was held to lie less with the governors than with the governed. Lord Curzon, one of those whose last duties are nearly 7 years as viceroy, was to welcome the royal visitors to India, and they were embroidered the theme with rare elegance. For what else in the world has a race gone forth and subdued? Not a country or a kingdom, but a continent, and that continented people not by savage tribes, but by races with traditions and a civilization that's older than our own, with a history not inferior to ours in dignity or romance, subduing them not to the law of the sword, but to the rule of justice, bringing peace and order and good government to nearly 1/5 of the entire human race, and holding them with so mild a restraint that the rulers are the merest handful among the ruled, a tiny speck of white foam among a dark and thunderous ocean. The Prince and Princess of Wales shared those beliefs. Curzon himself, however, he left an unfavorable impression on his guests. 3 months before their arrival, having scarcely begun his second term of office as the viceroy, he had been provoked to resign. It was the culmination of his bitter quarrel with both Lord Kitchener, who was commander-in-chief of the Army of India, and the cabinet in London, a formidable pair of adversaries. Ostensibly, the dispute was between two conflicting views of military administration, but those issues were blurred by personal enmity. Balfour's government obliged to sacrifice one or the other of the Indian antagonists. He decided that Curzon was the more expendable. To succeed him as a viceroy, they appointed Earl Minto, a less brilliant but energetic proconsul who had 5 times ridden in the Grand National and survived a broken neck. Curzon had spent many months planning the tour of the Prince and Princess of Wales. He begged that he might remain in India long enough to entertain them in Calcutta, then the capital and seat of government. Balfour and his colleagues were in no mood to maintain the slightest concession to so disobedient and openly contemptuous viceroy. At the succession of the king, however, they accepted a compromise. Minto's arrival in India was to be postponed for a week so that Curzon might have an honor of receiving the prince and princess as they disembarked from HMS Renown in Bombay. The royal tour would then begin. A week later, Curzon would return to Bombay to greet his successor and hand over the office of viceroy with traditional formality. The next day, he would sail to Europe. Curzon did not keep his side of the bargain. He welcomed the royal party as they set afoot for the first time on Indian soil. But a week later, he canceled the compliments and should have been paid to the new viceroy at the quayside. He failed to receive him as a custom demanded on the steps of the governor's house. And after an embarrassing pause appeared in a shooting coat and slippers. For his own departure on the following day, however, Curzon he drove down to the dock with a full visceral escort of 2 cavalry regiments and a battery of the Royal Horse Artillery. The superior person, as he was known in Oxford's days, had lived up to his name. The Prince and Princess of Wales had already left Bombay before Minto's arrival. But on reaching Calcutta at the end of December to stay with the new viceroy and Lady Minto, they not only heard the Curzons' outrageous behavior, they had a saga of their own to tell. Curzon, it seemed, had neglected to supervise the arrangements for their own arrival in Bombay. Their rooms at the government house had been occupied by others until the very last moment, so they had almost found the servants changing the sheets on the beds. And because Curzon had insisted on using the visceral vice-regal train until only 4 days before the royal party began their tour in it, neither carriages nor locomotive had been properly cleaned or overhauled. At a more relaxed age, such lapses may appear trivial. In the yielding social structure of British India, and any breach of protocol that affected the sovereign or his representative was profoundly shocking. The king, replying to the Prince of Wales' account of events at Bombay, wrote, "It is simply inconceivable that Lord Curzon should have shown such a bad manners. Let us hope that his state of health had much to do with it, as his mind before leaving India was simply unhinged." The clubs, the officers' messes, and drawing rooms, which thrived on tales and social solecism and Curzonian arrogance, were less charitable. They believed the Curzon's discourtesy had been deliberate. Imagine sending to succeed me, he was alleged to have said, "A gentleman only jumps hedges." The royal party heard many such stories during their tour and did not forget them. Talks with Kirchner also hardened the mind of the Prince of Wales against Curzon. He wrote to his father in January, "I've gained a lot of most interesting information since I've been in Calcutta with regard to the controversy between Lord C and Lord K. I fear the latter has been grossly misrepresented. The prince and his staff, particularly Sir Arthur Bigge, returned to England with an ingrained prejudice against Curzon, and it persisted for many years. Nothing is Nothing was wanting in the hospitality of the new viceroy and his wife, Lady Minto wrote in his journal. During our absence at Barrackpore, 700 men had been employed in painting, cleaning, and in preparing the house for the royal visit. The grounds in front of the house had 50 large tents to accommodate the staff and servants. Not our English idea of tents which one sees in Aldershot, but great rooms with brick floor covered with mats and carpets. Each person has a bedroom, a sitting room, and a bathroom, and even the valets have 2 armchairs apiece. By luncheon time, bullock wagons by the score, piled with royal luggage, were to be seen at the back premises stretching as far as the eye could see. There were 500 coolies who've been engaged to handle the luggage. The only hitch occurred at the levee. Lady Minto's record of it is imperturbable. A rumor has circulated that the prince did not intend on remaining beyond a certain hour, upon which a free fight ensued. Men fainted and were nearly trampled on. Their coats were torn, the plaster was broken off the pillars, the barriers were thrown down. The maimed and bleeding, of course, had to return home, but the remaining 2,123 were disposed of in 1 hour and 3/4. The prince's courtly manners were much appreciated. When he and the viceroy appeared together in public, he insisted in the king's emperor's representatives and should take precedence. Here, Lady Minto describes a dinner party at the government house in Calcutta. Shortly before the ladies left the room, the prince said to me, "I hope the viceroy realizes I shall join him after dessert. He must on no account come around to me." I told him how much Minto felt by the difficulty of the position. His answer was, "Surely I'm the first person to show consideration to my father's representative." He then took up the menu, on which he wrote, "You must remain in your place. I will come, and I will sit beside you when the ladies leave the dining room." Lady Minto enjoyed her guest's mild indiscretion. The prince described a recent dinner at Buckingham Palace, enlivened by Margot Asquith, the wife of the future Prime Minister, seeing Queen Alexandra and the rotund Lord Halsbury in conversation. Miss Asquith had explained, "Look at Beauty and the Beast." The prince continued, "As this was said in the hearing of Lady Halsbury, there was rather a scene, and Lady Halsbury refused to accept her apology. His high spirits could be deceptive." Sir James Dunlop Smith, the Viceroy's private secretary, wrote in his diary, "After church, the prince sent me and I After church, the prince sent for me, and I had a talk with him for 1.5 hours. My impression of him in Calcutta was that he was a very cheery and talkative young sailor, and just a little bit too outspoken. But at Barrackspore, I found that he had a distinct ability, a great shrewdness, and a wonderful memory. He talked to me about native states, the Indian Army, irrigation, railways, and sport. Throughout the tour, the prince owed much of the guidance to Sir Walter Lawrence, temporarily appointed to be his chief of staff. One of the ablest members of the Indian service, he had recently retired after 5 years as private secretary to Lord Curzon. His knowledge of the settled continent was therefore exceptionally wide. The prince and Lawrence acquired a great respect for each other that survived occasional differences. The prince would object to the Curzonian eloquence in the speeches which Lawrence wrote to him. Too highfalutin, he complained. Everyone will know that these are not my words." and he hated to be shadowed by the detective whom Lawrence had summoned for his protection. The chief of staff also laid down conditions that the prince should break with custom by accepting no presents from the Indian princes who otherwise would have competed with each other in extravagance. The notes of India, with the Prince of Wales prepared for the king, bear every mark of his own character: observant, kindly, and cautious. What particularly strikes the reader nearly 80 years later is an entire absence of that color prejudice which permeated every level of society in Edwardian age. There is a well known story of how Sir Charles Cust, in attendance on the prince at a shooting party in England, he rebuked a woman guest who shown undue familiarity towards his master. I have grown up on the steps of the throne, and I can tell you that there are three kinds of people in the world: blacks, whites, and royalties. The prince himself drew no such distinction between the British subjects of different color. It was a family virtue with Queen Victoria that had constantly displayed, not least in employing Indian, the Munshi Abdul Karim, and a confidential secretary. In her 80th year, she wrote to the Prime Minister of Lord Salisbury, "The future Viceroy must really shake himself more and more free from his red tapist, narrow minded council and entourage. He must be more independent. He must hear for himself what the feelings of the natives really are, and do what he thinks is right, and not be guided by the snobbish and vulgar, overbearing and offensive behavior of our civil and political agents. If we are to go on peaceably and happily in India, and to be liked and to be beloved by the high and the low, as well as respected as we ought to be, and not try to trample on the people and continually remind them and make them feel that they are conquered people." King Edward VII, touring India as Prince of Wales, similarly wrote, "Because a man has a black face and a different religion from our own, there is no reason why he should be treated as a brute." And having ascended the throne, he complained of the graceful habit of officers in the king's service, speaking of the inhabitants in India. Many of them sprung from the great races as, I'm not going to say this word, it starts with an N, Iggers. I'm not saying that word. His sons noted in 1906 that although instances of ill treatment were rare and disdainful attitudes could be hardly less wounding, I could not help being struck by the way in which all salutations by the natives were disregarded by the persons to whom they were given. Evidently, we too are much inclined to look upon them as conquered and downtrodden of a race, and the native, who is becoming more and more educated, realizes this. I could not help noticing that the general bearing of the Europeans towards the native was, to say the least, unsympathetic, in fact, not the same as those of superior to inferiors at home. He was astonished to learn that no Indian, whatever his birth or education, could be a member of the clubs frequented by Europeans, and he remained unconvinced by Sir Walter Lawrence's explanation that the clubs would be otherwise become too crowded, and that the British required an evening of unfettered conversation after a long day's work among Indians. The ruling chiefs, he continued, ought to be treated with greater tact and sympathy, more as equals than inferiors. They should no longer be treated as schoolboys, but even consulted by the government on matters which concern their states individually and as a whole. Indeed, he wondered whether the term native states was not in itself outmoded and offensive. With a characteristic attention to detail, the Prince of Wales also noted some puzzling anomalies. Why was the King Emperor's birthday celebrated in India on 23rd of June, the hottest time of the year, instead of on his actual birthday, which is 9 November? Why were civil servants not allowed white uniforms? Why were the governor of Bombay and Madras not greeted on official occasions by the national anthem? Why did not all British officers in native regiments wear the same uniform as native officers? The remarkable aspect of the prince's views is not that he wished to see his father's Indian subjects treated with justice and respect, but by 1906 those sentiments were widely shared, but that he did not accept the permanence of British tutelage as inevitable. He wrote to Lord Esher in the year after his Indian tour, "Personally, I think we have now come to the parting of the ways. We cannot let things rest as they are. We must either trust the natives more and give them a greater share in the government, or allow them to express their views, or else we must double our civil service. The latter have now gone out of the latter have now got out of touch with the villages on account of the great increase in their work. It is now all office work, where formerly they went amongst the natives every day, who were learned to know them and to trust them." Okay. In recognizing the possibility, to put it no higher, that the people of India must be encouraged to mold their own political destiny, the ill-educated heir to the throne revealed more vision than the most intellectually brilliant of viceroys, Lord Curzon. During his 7 years in India, Curzon had worked unsparingly to ensure the prosperity of her 300 million people, to preserve their customs and monuments, to maintain the highest standards in every branch of the administration. Kirchner and his staff had impressed the prince with tales of Curzon's hostility to the army. What they failed to tell the visitor was its main cause, the severity with which the viceroy had punished the mindless brutality committed by private soldiers and condoned by their officers. "I will not be a party to any of the scandalous hushing of bad cases," Curzon wrote to the king, "or to the theory that a white man may kick or batter a black man to death with impunity because he is only a damned," again, I'm not going to say that word, N-I-G-G, you get it. It is admirable, but it was not enough. Curzon wouldn't do anything for the Indian except trust him. When a friend in the cabinet wrote from England to ask why he did not educate Indians for senior government posts, he replied, "We cannot take the natives up into the administration. They are crooked-minded and corrupt. We have got, therefore, to go on ruling them, and we can only do it with success by both being kindly and virtuous. I dare say I am talking rather like a schoolmaster, but after all, the millions I have to manage are less than school children." The prince, by contrast, saw that some measure of self-government was the only alternative to an increasingly ponderous and alienated British administration. He liked neither solution, but at least his practical mind recognized the existence of both. The prince did, however, share with Curzon a sense of grievance that his country's well-meaning mission should evoke only hatred from the Indian National Congress. "It is becoming a power for evil," he told the king. "It misrepresents every action of the government and holds us up to the ignorant masses as monsters and tyrants." When in the course of his tour, he met Mr. Gopal Gokhale, president of the Congress Party, and he asked, Would the people of India be happier if you ran the country? Gokul replied, No, sir. I do not say they would be happier, but they would have more self-respect. That may be, said the prince, but I cannot see how there can be real self-respect while the Indians treat their women as they do. Yes, said Gokul, that is the great blot. The Congress leader later reproached Sir Walter Lawrence for having put the retort into the prince's mouth, but Lawrence denied it. The Prince of Wales mistrusted the motives of the nationalist leader, confident that India's needs were best served by a just paternalism. As heir to the throne, he shared his father's anxiety at the constitutional reforms inspired by the liberal government. As King Emperor, he watched India's troubled advance to independence with concern and sometimes anger. Yet he was no die-hard partisan. Rather did he see that his role transcended the conflict of politics, that his duty lay in the healing of discord and the protection of the inarticulate. On returning to London, in a speech which required weeks of preparation and days of rehearsal, he called for a better understanding and a closer union of hearts between the mother country and her Indian empire. Princess May, too, she acquired a lifelong love of India during the winter tour. Before leaving England, she had read several substantial works on the history and religion of the subcontinent. She knows more about the country. Dunlop Smith wrote in his diary, than a good many ladies I know out there who have spent years in India. She and her husband were alike. They were moved to see the Union Jack floating over the fortress of Jamrud and stirred by the splendor of medieval pageantry which greeted them at Benares. But her curiosity and her imagination opened up horizons that lay hidden from the prince. We went on the bridge, she wrote as the Renown began the long voyage home, and we watched dear beautiful India vanish from our sight. Those romantic memories never faded. Nearly 50 years later, on the night before she died, she had a book about India read out loud to her. She loved India. They loved India. The Prince and Princess of Wales were soon on their travels again, and within a few weeks they were returning from the East. They witnessed two of the traditional hazards of European monarchy: the attempted assassination in Spain and the democracy of Norway. The first took place at the wedding in Madrid of Princess Ina of Battenberg to the reigning sovereign, who was Alfonso XIII. The bride, a daughter of Princess Beatrice, Queen Victoria's youngest child, was obliged to abandon the angelical faith of her upbringing before marrying into the most tenaciously Roman Catholic of all royal households. The Prince of Wales, her first cousin, did not attempt to hide his disapproval. 2 months before the wedding, Dunlap Smith noted in his Indian diary, the prince and the king are very angry about Ina Battenberg marrying the King of Spain and turning into a Roman Catholic. The prince's language, it wasn't even parliamentary, and even the princess had to say, George, more than once. That outburst at Princess Ina's conversion sprang less from religious bigotry than from a respect for an established custom. It took unlikely forms. Stern disapproval had recently fallen on Sir Walter Lawrence, who was lunching one Sunday with the Wales family, When he declined the roast beef, the prince said, "You call yourself an Englishman and do not eat roast beef on a Sunday? You can't be an Englishman." The reluctant carnivore saw all the little eyes of the children on him, as though he were a renegade. On the way to Madrid for the wedding, the Prince and Princess of Wales spent a day in Paris. "We went to the Salon," he wrote, "and saw some ghastly pictures. Worse to come, here's the prince's own account of what followed the marriage ceremony. Just before our carriage reached the palace, we heard a loud report and thought it was the first gun of salute. We soon learned, however, that when about 200 yards from the palace in a narrow street, the Calais Mare, close to the Italian embassy, a bomb was thrown from an upper window at the king and queen's carriage. It burst between the wheel horses and the front of the carriage, killing about 20 people and wounding about 50 or 60. Mostly they were officers and soldiers. Thank God! Alfonso and Ina were not touched, although covered with glass from the broken windows. Of course, the bomb was thrown by an anarchist, supposed to be a Spaniard, and of course they let him escape. I believe the Spanish police and detectives are about the worst in the world. No precautions whatsoever have been taken. They are the most happy-go-lucky people here. Naturally, on their return, both Alfonso and Nina broke down. No wonder after such an awful experience. Eventually, we had lunch about 3. I proposed their healths. Not easy after the emotions caused by this terrible affair. It is one of the ironies of royal life that the first gun of a salute and an anarchist bomb make precisely the same round. A week or 2 later, the Prince and Princess of Wales sailed across the North Sea in the royal yacht Victoria and Albert to attend the coronation of Trondheim of the King and Queen of Norway. For nearly a century, Norway had been unhappily united to Sweden. After the dissolution of the Union in 1905, Prince Charles of Denmark had ascended the throne of Norway as King Haakon VII. He was, however, a king with difference. He reigned not by hereditary right, but by invitation, not by the grace of God, but by the majority vote of the plebiscite. King Leopold II of the Belgians spoke for all his brother sovereigns in refusing to equate Vox Populi with Vox Dei. A leader of the Socialist Party, by profession a doctor, once ingratiatingly observed that if ever Belgium became a republic, the king would be chosen as its first president. Leopold replied, "I suppose, my dear doctor, that you would be flattered if someone told you what an excellent veterinary surgeon you would make." There was a sparse attendance at European royalty at the coronation festivities in Trondheim. It is doubtful whether King Edward would have sent his heir to represent him had not the Queen been his own daughter, Maud, and the new king a nephew by marriage. Princess May's aunt, the Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, broke out in a rash of italics. "A revolutionary coronation! Such a farce! I do not like your being there." "Makes me sick, and I should say to you too," her niece replied. "The whole thing seems curious, but we live in very modern days." The Prince of Wales consoled himself with catching a 28-pound salmon. His wife was shopping for furs, china, and enamels. Queen Maud was shy and plagued with neuralgia. never wholly adjusted to her life and to her Norwegian life. Her subjects, they thought her remote and disobliging. She thought them ungrateful and insatiable. A prolonged legal squabble over the interpretation of her marriage contract cast another shadow over those years in exile. She thought she sought relief in laying out an English garden in the royal residence at Bugdo Kansgard, and in returning to spend each summer at her house near Sandringham. Her brother, too, he was thankful to be home again. Under Big's guidance, he settled down to a program of public engagements that in its essentials they differed little from year to year. Lady Monkswell, a wife of the chairman of the London County Council, described in her diary that opening up a new Westminster tramway, the poor prince, who has not too much hair, had to hold his hat 3 inches above his head nearly the whole way to Tooting and back. These kind, good royalties took such trouble to do everything as well as possible. He also broadened his political knowledge by reading cabinet and foreign office papers made available to him by the king's command, attending debates in the House of Lords, sitting on a royal commission to consider food and imports in a time of war, and dining with the leading statesmen of the day. After one such meeting, Balfour told Esher, "Except the German emperor, he is the only royal prince to whom I find I can talk to as a man." The author, A Defense of Philosophic Doubt, added, "He really is clever." There is no reason to dispute the sincerity of Balfour's first remark. His second was surely a piece of flattery which, knowing his man, he could expect Esher to pass on to the prince. For all his growing dedication to duty, the Prince of Wales did not take easy to public life. He was troubled by a succession of minor ailments. This included chronic dyspepsia that almost was certainly due to frayed nerves. When the prince visited Holy Island in 1908, the architect Edwin Lutens noted, "He was terribly alarmed at the gangway up and wanted a wall built. He was awfully anxious to get away when he found the tide was rising. For a sailor, I thought him over-nervous." That year, he attended the annual dinner of the Royal Academy of Arts. But absolutely, he refused to make a speech. Esther wrote, "How much HRH may dislike it, he will have to give way, or the monarchy will be doomed." One appointment in particular provoked him to an ill temper, that of a large warden of Cinque Ports. The holder of that ancient office had originally been responsible for the defense of the Channel coast by sea and land. In the 18th century, however, it had become a well-paid sinecure for a royal favorite such as William Pitt. By the reign of Queen Victoria, the post had not only been stripped of its emoluments, it also required the Lord Warden to pay for the upkeep of his official residence, which was Walmer Castle. The Duke of Wellington was well content to occupy it on those terms, and he died there in 1852. The later Lords Warden included Palmerston, Granville, W.H. Smith, Salisbury, and Curzon. The last of these held the appointments for barely 4 months, resigning in 1904 after his wife had almost died of an illness which he attributed to the faulty drains of the castle. That charnel house, he called it, it was unfit for human habitation. The prince was not exactly flattered when Balfour, as prime minister, invited him to succeed Curzon. as the Lord Warden. He accepted, but on certain conditions. He would neither occupy nor maintain so inconvenient and insanitary a residence as Walmore Castle. He would dispense with the elaborate installation ceremony, and while proud to bear the title of Lord Warden, he would undertake none of its parochial duties. Almost at once he began to receive requests to perform just those local functions which he had asked to relinquish. He was urged to convene the Court of Shipway, to attend to the businesses of Dover Harbor Board, to nominate the magistrates of the Cinque Ports. "I deeply regret," he told Big on 15 August 1905, "that I ever accepted the position." "I was against it from the beginning," Big agreed. "The Cinque Ports," he observed, "seemed to regard the prince as their own property." After 2 years of grumbling, the Brotherhood and the guestlings of the Cinque Ports publicly declared that the prince's refusal either to be installed as Lord Warden or to fulfill the duties of the office, it was detrimental to the best interests of the ports, and it would imperil one of the most ancient institutions of the kingdom. The prince had had enough of those disrespectful burghers. "No nonsense this time," he told Big on September 1907. "I shall stick to my guns and resign." He succeeded by Lord Brassley, whose ample fortune derived from railway contracting, and it enabled him to make improvements to Walmore Castle. Brassey resigned as Lord Warden in 1913. "More was expected of me," he wrote, "than I was able to do. Only in the name did the Prince of Wales belong to the silent service, in contrast with his wife, whose strongest expression of disapproval was, 'Not very wise. He would damn and blast with the best.' Lord Eschard called him a Garcon eternal. Perhaps it was a brisk intemperance of youth which continued to release in him a flow of outspoken and sometimes indiscreet talk. Or perhaps the chatter masked an insecurity with neither Princess May nor Big could relieve. He returned from India in 1906, using what John Morley, the Secretary of State, called most unmeasured language against Curzon, and he complained to Charles Harding, the future viceroy, that Curzon could not have done a single thing right in India, an opinion which Harding instantly challenged. Okay, just a couple more pages and I will be done with this chapter. The prince found much to disparage the Liberal government, which was swept to power by the general elections of 1906. After dinner at Windsor one night in 1908, he discussed with Winston Churchill who was likely to succeed the ailing Campbell Bannerman as Prime Minister. When Churchill said it would be Asquith, the prince replied in a loud voice that although he trusted Asquith, he thought him not quite a gentleman. This remark was overheard by Knowles, and who in some alarm went up to Princess Victoria and asked her to break up the conversation. Recalling the episode in 1914, the Prince of Wales, by now he was the king. He admitted that Asquith had later shown his dislike, and that he could not blame him. "I ought not to have said it, and it was a damn stupid thing to say." But Winston repeated it to Asquith, which was a monstrous thing to do, and it made great mischief. At another dinner party, the prince leaned across the table toward Sir George Murray, the permanent Secretary of Treasury, and he bellowed, "I can't think, Sir George, how you can go on serving that damn fellow Lord George." Admiral Sir John Fisher was another powerful man from the prince's indiscretions, and it turned into a lifelong enemy. They had known each other since 1882, when one was a midshipman in the Bashant and the other was in command of the Inflexible. For many years, they maintained a confidential correspondence. In 1903, a second sea level lord, Fisher noted, "He is most cordial and friendly and has helped me immensely with all these new arrangements we have been introducing." Those changes included improvements in naval entry and education, the recognition of engineering as an essential subject of study, and better conditions on the lower deck. In the following year, Fisher became the first Sea Lord, and he embarked on a series of even more radical reforms. He strengthened the home fleet at the expense of less vulnerable stations. He conserved manpower by scrapping large numbers of small and obsolete ships. He put a nucleus crew on board reserve ships to keep them in a state of permanent efficiency. He initiated a construction program of fast battleships and cruisers with big guns. Fisher also demonstrated his faith in the submarine by taking the Prince to sea in one of them off Portsmouth. Princess May also remained on the quay and was heard to murmur, "I'll be very disappointed if George doesn't come up again." In 1908, the Prince sailed to Canada, and back in HMS Indomitable, a new battle cruiser that owed as much to Fisher's vision as to the builder's yard. Her armament was not in doubt. She mounted 12-inch guns, nor by the end of the voyage was her speed. During the return journey, her average was a fraction below 25 knots, almost equaling the record for an Atlantic crossing of 25.08 knots, set by the liner Lusitania. Both the Prince and Big took their turn in the stokehole, emerging black with coal dust. "She is indeed a grand ship," the Prince told Fisher, "and the finest steamer I have ever seen." Those friendly congratulations masked the Prince's growing mistrust of the first Sea Lord. It was not so much that he disagreed with Fisher's naval policy, although he did regret the reduction of Britain's traditional naval strength in the Mediterranean. What provoked him to be outspoken was his hostility with the ruthlessness of Fisher's methods. "I do not believe in the Sermon on the Mount for managing the fleet," the first Sea Lord liked to boast, or borrowing both the language and the sentiments of the Old Testament. He would swear that of those officers who attempted to thwart him, their wives should be widows, their children fatherless, their homes a dunghill. The price which the nation paid for a powerful navy was a professional feud which embittered personal relationships for almost a generation. Fisher's principal antagonist was the Admiral Lord Charles Beresford, commander-in-chief of the fleet of the Channel Fleet. He was less intellectual, he was less shrewd, he was less visionary than Fisher, but wanting neither in patriotism nor courage, and he was adored by his men. Vain and volatile in temperament, he allowed patrician attitudes to affect his judgment. His brother, the 5th Marquess of Waterford, scorned Fisher's middle-class parentage and supposed Asiatic blood. The two admirals fought each other with every weapon that came to hand, and both had powerful allies in Parliament, press, and in the court. It was a measure of the Prince of Wales' involvement that he should have sought the downfall of one of his father's closest friends, and confided in one of his father's most troublesome enemies. For King Edward VII, although sometimes exasperated by Fisher's boisterous manners, was captivated by his prophetic genius and rejuvenated by his salty wit. Beresford, by contrast, had been in disfavor with the king, since a quarrel in the 1890s. Both men in their time enjoyed the favors of Lady Brooke, who later became the celebrated socialist, the Countess of Warwick. Indeed, the Prince of Wales, as he then was, he'd end his letters to her with an unusual endearment. He would write, "Good night, and God keep you, my adored little daisy wife. Forever yours, your only love." Beresford was less constant in his affection, breaking off the liaison in 1889 in order to be reconciled to his own wife. Lady Brooke not only reproached her late lover with infidelity, she also appealed to her royal protector, who unwisely had Lady Charles Beresford banished from the court during her husband's absence at sea. On his return to London, Beresford was reported to have struck his future sovereign in the course of an angry encounter at Marlborough House. Certainly he cut him dead in the royal enclosure at Ascot. Although apologies were eventually exchanged, their friendship had lost its pristine bloom. Prince George was a stranger to that world of domestic disorder. He nevertheless gave loud and unqualified support to Beresford in the Battle of the Tritons. Any lingering regard which the prince might have felt for Fisher vanished when he learned that the First Sea Lord had encouraged one of Beresford's subordinate officers, Captain Reginald Bacon, to send him private reports on the conduct of his own commander-in-chief. Beresford wrote to a friend in October 1909, "I saw the Prince of Wales yesterday at Newmarket. He was really quite violent against the mulatto. He said that he must go, or the Navy would be ruined. I told him that the Navy was nearly ruined now." Fisher was not only aware of the prince's hostility, but also suspected that there had been a spy in his own camp, too. He asked Lord Fisher, "Do you think the Prince of Wales at all realizes what would happen if the public, especially the Radical Party, knew he was actively taking Beresford's side and saying I must go? And he is now doing and openly said at the Royal Yacht Dinner last Saturday, and that his bosom friend, Captain Campbell, had been doing a Judas, perpetually at my house, and selling me all the time to Beresford." There was justice in Fisher's complaint. It was imprudent of the prince to allow himself the same luxury of expression as a private person. The feud between him and Fisher continued to smolder throughout the next decade. And that is the end of chapter 3. So I will end it there, but we are only a little bit through the book. It's a very good to read about King George V and changes during that time. So I hope you will follow me tomorrow. I'm going to read about the early part, chapter 4, the early part of his reign. So